Choosing a pastor for a church is not an easy exercise. But I want to share with you some results of a recent computerized survey that might help. This survey indicates that the perfect pastor preaches exactly 15 minutes. I'm not perfect, so I'll be a little bit longer than that. He condemns sin, but he never upsets anyone. He works from 8 a.m. until midnight. He's also the janitor of the church. Makes $800 a week, wears good clothes, buys good books, drives a good car, and gives about $300 weekly to the poor. He's 28 years old. He's been preaching for 30 years. He has a burning desire to work with teenagers. He spends all of his time with senior citizens. The perfect minister smiles all the time with a straight face because he has a sense of humor that keeps him seriously dedicated to his work. He makes 15 calls daily on congregational families, shut-ins, and the hospitalized, but is always in the office when needed. He's tall on the short side, heavy-set in a thin sort of way, and handsome. He has eyes of blue or brown to fit the occasion. He wears his hair parted in the middle. Left side is dark and straight, right side is brown and wavy. Unfortunately, this pastor is unavailable as he burnt himself out and died at the age of 32. Well, if choosing a pastor for a church is an important task, choosing one of the 12 disciples who will start this whole thing called the church is even more important. That's why Jesus, before choosing the 12 disciples that he did, spends an entire night praying about it, asking his Father, who should I pick? Because he wants to make sure that whoever he chooses is going to set a pattern for every person who comes after. Now, for those of you who have not been here for the last few weeks, we're in the middle of a summer series of messages called The 12. And what we're doing is looking at some of these individuals. We try and learn some lessons from these people that Jesus called to be the closest to him. Lessons that will hopefully help us to become what God intended for us to become when he chooses us. Now, it's easy for us 2,000 years later to kind of look at the choices that Jesus made and said, wow, we think he did a pretty good job. But very early on, there may have been those at that time of history who would have really questioned the decision-making that Jesus does in choosing who he chooses. And the person we're going to look at today, we're going to examine his life, would certainly have been a question mark in the minds of many, many people in the first century. But as we've already seen from three of the individuals that we've looked at Peter, looked at Thomas, we've looked at Philip. Jesus sees in these people something that others weren't able to see. There was potential that he could see that was inherent in their lives, and so he chooses people based on what they would become, not what they were. Which is exactly how he chooses every one of us. Because when we come to Christ, we're probably not really doing that great. We're not much to look at, but Jesus sees something in us. I think I can work with that person. I think I can do something with them. And so the person we're going to look at today, his name is John. John is called to follow Christ at exactly the same time as his brother James, and we're going to look at it. It's on the screen. This is where it happens. Going on from there, Jesus sees two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, so we know his dad's name, his brother John. They're in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, went up to them, and said, I want you to follow him. And immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So what do we know about John? Well, we know a few things. First of all, we know he's a fisherman because we're told he's preparing nets, working with his dad. Because his name comes after John in the Bible, that means he was likely younger than his brother. He was good friends with Peter and Andrew, two other brothers. They come from exactly the same town. They're involved in the same line of work. They're all fishermen. It's possible, we don't know this for sure, but it's possible he comes from a rather wealthy or an influential family, because we will read later that he's well known to the high priest, and that would not have happened if you weren't kind of up there in the echelons of society. He eventually will become the writer of 5 of the books of the New Testament, including that very interesting book called the Book of Revelation, a study of the end times. Church history tells us that he will become the pastor of one of the most influential churches in the first century, the church in Ephesus. And Paul, who writes much of the New Testament, will refer to him in Galatians chapter 2, verse 9 as being one of the pillars of the church. So this is a man who is going to come over time to a place of great prominence. He is highly respected in the early church, a man that we would look at today and study his writings, because from his writings come much of the things that we believe, the theology that we hold to. But that is not the way that his discipleship with Christ started. In fact, early in his walk with Jesus, he might have been someone that if you and I had been there and we had to judge him, we would have said, you know what? We think you're fired. We don't think you're gonna make it. Or at the very least, we would have had some deep reservations about this man. Now, he's one of the 12 that we have a fair amount of information about. There's a lot written about him. He shows up in a number of different stories. And when we read about him, we find that at the very beginning, he is a rather aggressive, competitive, intolerant hothead. And he seems to be always on the wrong side of who Christ was and what he taught. And of course, that begs the question, how is it possible for someone who at the beginning was so opposite to the character of Christ, over time eventually becomes so important to the growth of the early church? And the answer to that question, how do you get from here to here? Well, it really involves 2 key factors. First of all, and this is really good news for you and I today, well, at least it is for me, because I know where I come from and who I am. Jesus is going to stick with this man by the name of John. He teaches him, he corrects him, he shows great patience towards him. He kind of slowly brings him along from where he is to where Jesus wants him to be. And secondly, we find this man, John, an individual who's willing to learn. He's such a teachable individual. He doesn't rebel against correction. Instead, he takes the instruction that Jesus gives him, takes it to heart, and over time, you start to see a change in him. So these 2 key factors, Jesus wants to change us, we need to be willing to be changed. And that's something that we need today, to incorporate both of those things into our lives. God is always going to bring us to the place that he wants us to be, which is a place of maturity and growth. If, and it's a really big if we are teachable. So God will correct us. He will instruct us. He will give us places in our lives that we need to change. But we need to be willing to change. And so here's a question. I don't want you to answer it. Don't want you to put your hands up. But it's a question we all need to answer. Are we teachable people? Are we willing to learn and to grow? But here's something else that's really important for us to note. When Christ changes us, he doesn't start over. He doesn't kind of begin work in our lives in the place where, okay, I don't like that guy's personality. I don't like that lady's personality. I'm going to change their personality. I'm going to give them new talents. I'm going to give them new abilities. He doesn't wipe the hard drive clean. He doesn't hit the delete button as to who we are when he finds us. But what he does do is he takes us as we are, and he begins to shape us and to temper us and to refine us so that we are still who we are, but we're sufficiently different that it's like we are new creations. It's what the Bible calls the transformation process. It's like the craftsman who finds a clay vase, or maybe they have a piece of furniture and boy, it's just decrepit. It has a number of faults in it. There's defects. But instead of throwing that piece of furniture out and saying, I can't work with that, and I'm going to start with something brand new, that craftsman takes that piece of furniture, remakes it, refashions it, sands it, paints it, whatever he has to do, until the value of that piece of furniture increases and its use is much more now available. And so for a craftsman, in the right hands, that item gets transformed from useless to useful, from less to more. And that's exactly what Jesus is going to do with this man named John and what he does with us. And there are at least 3 key places where we read about this transformation process being implemented. I want you to look at them with me this morning. First of all, truth gets tempered with love. This man, John, is often referred to as the apostle of love. And mostly that is given to him because he has so much to say about the subject. It's John who writes the best known verse in the entire Bible, for God so loved the world. It's John who tells us that God doesn't just act in love, but his essence is love. It's this disciple that has so much to say about people loving one another. But that emphasis on love that he displays later in his life was certainly not who John was in his early life. And there's one particular incident that I want to bring to your attention that we need to look at. It's found in Mark chapter 9, 38 to 41. And this is the story, what happens. Teacher, that's Jesus, teacher, said John, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he's not one of us. Jesus says, don't stop him, for no one who does any miracle in my name in the next moment can say anything bad about me, for whoever's not against us is for us. Truly, I tell you, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name because you belong to the Messiah will certainly not lose their reward. We're not told exactly when this incident happens, but it must have been just a short time earlier. And we don't know all the details, but John and another disciple see a man. It's not part of their group, but he's a man who is casting out, or at least attempting to cast out demons. And John goes up to him, and he's going to put the brakes on this thing before it goes very far. And so he goes up to this man, and he says, whoa, hold on here a minute. You got to stop that. Who gave you the right to cast out demons? You're not part of our little group. You're not a follower of Jesus. We're the only ones that should be doing this. Now, we're not told this, but it's very possible that John was quite proud of himself for keeping things in order, for keeping things pure and right. Because you just can't have everybody and anybody casting out demons. What if they don't do it in the right way? What if they don't get the words right? What if they don't have the formula correct? Because there's a right and a wrong way to do things, you know. Jesus has to come to him and correct John. Now, it's not that truth isn't important. Maybe John was doing the right thing, I don't know. But truth without love can be such a brutal thing. It's why Paul in the book of Ephesians is going to combine two things together, and he's going to say, speak the truth in love. Now, I know I'm not talking about anybody here in this building today, thank goodness. But there are those who are really good at upholding truth, and they speak it whenever they get the opportunity. But it seems they've forgotten the second half of the equation of that verse, because what they speak is not done in love. And if you don't have love coupled with truth, it is always going to come across as something harsh and something ugly and something that's mean. And when that happens, there's very little good that is going to come from that. So a zeal for truth is actually a very good thing, but it has to be tempered by a love for people. So a disciple of Christ, somebody who follows Jesus even today, has to realize that cold, hard truth doesn't change anybody. But when the motivating force behind truth is love, it's amazing how people will respond to that. Some of you may have heard, they're not so much in the news anymore, but a few years ago, a church in Kansas called the Westboro Baptist Church. You will rarely, if ever, hear me speak negatively of another church, but this one is the exception. This is a church who runs a website called GodHatesFags.com. Has picketed over 41,000 churches, funerals of AIDS victims, various other public events. And they do it, what they say is all in the name of love. Now, there may be, I even hate to admit it, but there may be a couple of times where truth comes out from them, but they have done such a major disservice to the name of Christ because of the hate and the venom that they spew out almost every time they speak. And they may say, oh, we're just upholding truth. But they're doing it in the most despicable way possible. They have totally ignored teachings of Paul. Speak the truth in love. I think if John was visiting us this morning, he might say, you know, I was a little bit like that early in my journey with Christ. But I learned from Jesus that truth has to be tempered with love. Otherwise, it's just a resounding gong. It's a clanging cymbal. You might recognize those words from Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. So truth is so important to John. In fact, he's going to write that word so many times in his 5 books. I think he tended to be kind of a very black and white person. There wasn't a whole lot of gray in his life. But by the time he writes his 5 books, he's become so much more balanced in his life. The word truth is going to appear 42 times. That's where he's going to write it. 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. 42 times the word truth appears. But the word love shows up over 80 times. Truth tempered with love. Secondly, he discovers that ambition has to be tempered with humility. In Mark chapter 9, verse 33, Jesus happens to overhear his disciples, and they're arguing about something. And so when they get to where they're going, he says, so hey guys, what were you arguing about? What's going on here? You're fighting about something. What is it? And they don't want to answer him because they know he wouldn't like the answer. But he already knows. And he knows that what they were arguing about was which of the 12 happened to be the greatest. Who is the most important? Who is ranked number 1? And they're arguing about, oh, I think I am. No, I think I am. You've got so many faults. I'm much better than you. And so Jesus tries to teach them that greatness in his mind is defined very differently in his world than in theirs. But as he teaches them, they miss the entire point. Because it's just a few verses later, Mark chapter 10, James and John, we're talking about this guy today, along with their mother, like you need your mom to ask this question for you. They come to Jesus. The other disciples don't seem to be present. They're not sure what's going on here. And James and John, along with their mother, go up to Jesus and say, hey, when you get to the throne, because they think he's going to set up an earthly kingdom, when you get to the throne, we want to be on either side of it. We want to sit on the right, and we want to sit on the left. Now, what they were doing was saying, we're better than anybody else. We deserve the best seats in the house. Can you imagine such a crass request? But before we condemn these men as being selfish and proud, we might want to check our own thoughts. Because it's very possible that sometimes we don't act a whole lot differently than them. I mean, don't we like to be noticed as being important? If your name was ever left off a list of thank yous, thank you to George, thank you to Sally, thank you to Peter, and I'll say, like, hey, what? You missed my name. What about me? I was part of it. We can get so upset at those moments. If somebody gets more than us, a bigger piece of pie than we do, we get very deeply offended. So when I go to a restaurant with my wife and we order dessert, I always make sure to tell the waiter or the waitress, make sure that I get a bigger piece than my wife. Just that way I won't be upset about it. But really, we're no different than John. And so Jesus has to reteach his disciples what his way is like. And he says, you want to know the way to greatness? Do you know how I define first place in my kingdom? And here it is, Mark 9:35. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all. Now, we read some of these verses of John, and we might be tempted to ask this question of Jesus, are you absolutely sure that you want a man like this on your team? Isn't he going to embarrass you at times? Isn't he the exact opposite of what you're trying to build? And the answer is, yeah, that is true. But because Jesus can see something in John that maybe nobody else can see, he knows what John's going to become by the end of his journey. I can tell you this morning, I am so glad that God did not give up on me in the first years of my walk with him. Considering all the mistakes I've made, the dumb things that I've said, I think God could have been well within his rights to say, yeah, you know what, I'm kind of rethinking this whole thing. This Murray guy, he's really not much to look at to begin with. He's caused me a fair amount of headaches. So I think it would be better we just kind of kick him off the team and let's see if we can choose somebody else. But God saw something in me when maybe not very many else did. And I can tell you this, that he sees something in you. And if we will let God do his work in us, changing us into the image of Christ, we will get from here to here. Let me just illustrate just very quickly how much this man changes from pride to humility. If you were to read the Gospel of John and the 3 little letters that he writes, not once does he ever refer to himself by using his name. Now, he will call himself the other disciple, or the disciple that Jesus loved, but he will not name himself. And it's like he's being so careful to be the opposite of who he used to be, a man filled with pride and wanting to be recognized. Now, there is still a little bit of a hint of this man's old nature, because one of the very funny things in the Bible that I find is found in John chapter 20, verses 3 and 4. The disciples have just found out that the tomb is empty. One of the women come and say, hey, Jesus' tomb is empty. Jesus isn't there. They don't believe the women, and so they run to the tomb. So Peter and John run to the tomb, and this is what it says. So Peter and the other disciple, now that's John referring to himself, very humble, I don't want to name myself. Peter and the other disciple ran to the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple, who's that? That's John. The other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. So he's so humble not to name himself, even though everybody knows who he's talking about, but he wanted everybody to know that he was the better athlete. The other disciple, I don't want to name him, but the other disciple beat Peter to the tomb. He's a much better athlete, much more in shape. Peter's a little tubby, couldn't make it. I got there first. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong message today, because there's nothing wrong with ambition. There's nothing wrong with having dreams and goals and wanting to achieve. I think we should do the best we can in everything we do. We should go as far as we can. So if you can be first in your class, hey, do it. If you can grow your company to number 1, go for it. But let your ambition be tempered with humility. Let your dreams be tempered with servanthood. Let your goals be to glorify Christ instead of yourself. And then thirdly, John is going to learn this lesson, that zeal needs to be tempered with compassion. Just one more change that we are aware of. In Luke chapter 9, we read about Jesus going through Samaritan country. If you know anything about the Bible, Samaritans and Jews did not exactly like each other. And normally a Jew would walk around Samaria and Samaritans would never go to Jerusalem. And so we read Jesus, he's going through Samaritan country. He sends a couple of his followers, John being one of them, to go into town to prepare his coming. Maybe he's looking for a hotel room. Maybe he's looking for supper that night. We don't know. But because of the hostilities between the Jews and the Samaritans, the townspeople respond this way. They say, no way are you staying here. You guys are Jews. You're headed for Jerusalem. You're not welcome in our town, so get out. And this is what it says in the next verse, Luke 9:54. When the disciples, James and John, these two brothers, saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them? Wow. What a response from people who were supposed to be like Jesus. And so there's James and John. Okay, Lord, you know what? You just stand back. We're going to vaporize this town. They deserve to die for their poor manners. If they can think that they can treat us like dirt, we're going to show them a thing or two. So let the fire fall. That'll teach people to close the door in our face. Sounds so unchristlike. Maybe our first reaction to John's words might be, what in the world were you thinking, John? Calling down fire from heaven to obliterate an entire town because you got offended. But before we do that, we need to be honest this morning, because who of us hasn't thought something similar when somebody offends us? So maybe we don't call fire down from heaven, but we do think, oh boy, I hope God teaches that person a lesson. I hope they have a fender bender on the way home tonight. I hope they lose that contract that they were so proud about. I hope something else bad happens to them. That'll teach them. But what we need to remember about John is that because of his immaturity, this call for fire from heaven probably shouldn't be an unexpected response from him. In fact, when Jesus first calls James and John to follow him, just like he did to Peter, he gives them a nickname immediately. He knows something about them. In fact, he calls them sons of thunder, indicating that James and John probably had a problem with their temper. You rub them the wrong way, they just might explode in your face. Say the wrong thing and you might get a verbal, or you might even get a real punch to the head. Now, these two brothers, James and John, when they believed in something, they were zealous for it. They're in all the way. They're 100% committed. You don't want to accept Jesus in your town? Boom, you're dead. But their zealousness had so little compassion. Yeah, the fire we're calling down from heaven might kill a few innocent people. Yeah, a few women and children may die, but you have to teach people. You can't let them get away with things. Zero compassion. I mean, what happens to the words where Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy, I came to save people? But again, John is going to allow Jesus to temper him to the point that when we read those 3 little letters near the end of the Bible, we find example after example of a man who's still zealous for truth, still wants holiness to reign, but he also has compassion in his voice. And over again in those little letters, you'll find these phrases when he's talking to these early Christians, and he says, dear brothers, dear children. So he hasn't lessened in his passion for doing the right thing and wanting people to go the right way, but now instead of being an angry zealot, there is this loving compassion. In fact, listen to these words. This is what John writes. He says, if anyone says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he's a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. Now, I wonder when John was writing those words, did his mind go back to that day in that Samaritan town when he wanted to put it all, like just get rid of this town? You have to admit, It's a major change from wanting to burn a town down to saying you can't hate another person. Now let me go back to what I said earlier. How does this change occur? How does one combine love with truth, humility with ambition, compassion with zeal? How does a person change so dramatically from wanting to be the first, thinking he's the most important, thinking he's the only person who knows truth, wants to wipe out an entire village? Let me give you a couple of verses that may answer that question, because John writes these verses himself. 1 John chapter 1, verse 3. Our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. I think if you were to ask a question, if you would take John to Timber tomorrow morning and say, hey, John, how did you change? I think he would say this, I spent so much time in the presence of Jesus. And the more time I spent with him, the more he just rubbed off on me. That's how you and I change today. That's how you and I get tempered. We just spend a lot of time with Jesus. And it kind of just spills over. We start becoming and thinking and sounding like him. And then the second verse on the screen, 1 John 2:6, whoever claims to live in him, in Jesus, must walk as Jesus did. So I can't claim to be a disciple and then walk differently from Jesus. Remember the very first sermon in this series, a disciple is intent on becoming like their teacher, like their rabbi. In fact, your goal in life was to copy Jesus in every way. And finally, John's going to write, you can't claim to be a disciple of Jesus and stay stuck where you are. We need to walk like Jesus walked. We need to act like Jesus acted. We need to talk like Jesus talked. We need to think like Jesus thinks. And you can make that change. You can get from here to here by staying close to him. You can change. You can become Christ-like. It will not happen in a day or a month, but it will happen over time as we continue to walk with him. You continue to be a teachable student. I continue to be a teachable student, and we will change to become like Jesus. I invite the worship team to come back. By the time John dies, as far as we know, he's the only disciple that wasn't killed for his faith. All the other disciples, all his friends have been killed. He'll be banished to a prison island called Patmos, just off the coast of what is now Turkey. He will live in a cave in the harshest of conditions. But instead of trying to call fire down on his captives, he writes the book of Revelation. He'll die somewhere around 100 AD, probably in his 90s. Extremely old for that time of history. It's said that in the last few months of his life, he actually had to be carried to church on a Sunday, and he was constantly known for saying, "My little children, love one another." Let me close with this today. Maybe sometimes you despair about becoming who you'd like to become. Am I ever going to make it? Will I ever become the disciple, the follower of Jesus that I really want to be? I think we just have to look at John, and we have hope. You see, God chose you because he knew that if you would fellowship with him, if you would hang around him, if you would walk with him, you would find yourself slowly transformed, tempered by his presence. Just like John was. Changed. Such a different person than when Jesus first met him. And if you're willing to let Jesus change, if you're a teachable person, it will happen. There'll be some bumps and bruises along the way, but you will change. Because that's just the way it works. Spending time with Jesus changes us. So I want you to bow your heads today. Just close your eyes for a moment. I want to ask you this question. If you've never decided that you wanted to be a follower of Jesus, that's the starting place. That's where we say yes to following him, and that's where the change begins, and we become what we know that is inside of us but isn't out yet. And all you have to do is just say yes to him. And the way you can do that this morning is just by raising a hand and saying, yes, I want to follow Jesus. Don't know what it's going to take, where it's going to take me, don't know what's going to happen, but I want to follow him. And if that's you today, just raise your hand very quickly, put it down. Not going to embarrass you, not going to call you out, but I do want to pray for you in closing. Just quickly raise a hand, say, you know what, I want to start that journey with Christ today. I think I'll do it this morning. Anybody at all? Last week, somebody did this for the very first time in their life, and we're in contact with them now. Anybody at all? Okay, let me ask this question, second one. Do you ever look at yourself in the mirror and say, oh my goodness, not who I want to be? Why did I do that? Why did I say that? And you're still asking Jesus to change you. You still want to grow. And maybe there's something specific you're thinking about today that happened this week. And you would like to say in closing today, you know, Murray, would you just pray for me that I can actually become like Jesus, look more like him than less like him? If you just quickly put your hand up and down, I'll pray for you. Again, I'm not going to embarrass you, not going to call you up or anything like that. You just want prayer this morning to become more like Jesus. Just lift your hand very quickly. Yep, 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 yeah. Many, many people, yeah. Heavenly Father, anybody who's been walking with you for a while would probably look back and say, yeah, there's been some major changes in my life. I'm not the firebrand, I'm not the scared person, I'm not the selfish. You've changed me. And we all want that. We all want to become more like you. So Lord, for every person here today who has a desire to change, who has a teachable spirit, I pray that this week you will help us just make another step, another change in becoming more like our teacher, more like our rabbi. And I ask this, Lord, with your power coming into our lives, amen. Amen. Why don't you stand with me? I want you to go back to that last song we sang, and could we do verse 1 and the last section there? Because I think this is kind of John when he first met Jesus, and then at the end, the church starts, and John's a vital part of this thing called the early church, and gets the thing off the ground and gets it growing, and essentially that's all Jesus wants us to do, is be part of his church and do what we can to helping this whole thing get together. So let's sing that song together. Which one? No, sorry, not that one. The one before it. I'm wrong. There I am. Make a mistake. And you thought I was perfect. Okay, the second last song is the one I really want.
Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings.
Verse 1.
And the morning that you rose, all of heaven held its breath, till that stone was moved for good, for the Lamb had conquered death. And the dead rose from their tombs, and the angels stood in awe, for the souls of all who'd come to the Father are restored. And the church of Christ was born, then the Spirit lit the flame. Now this gospel truth of old shall not kneel, shall not faint. By his blood and in his name, in his freedom I am free. For the
Lord, I'm so glad that you're working in our lives. You take us where you find us, and you bring us to the best place that we can be. You see the potential in us, and you're patient and you're kind. And as long as we're teachable, you're gonna help us. You're gonna bring us to where we should be. And I pray that as we leave this place this morning, there's just that sense in us that God can do it. He is working in us. And so, Lord, may this week be a time for us to again prove to you that we are followers, students of Jesus. And we ask it in your name. And everybody said, amen. God bless you. Have an incredible week.